In the summer of 2019, my girlfriend Jess and I took an extended vacation for 3 months. I had saved up my vacation for years and then went to part-time to extend it even further. Jess ended up quitting her job at the medical ICU in order to get enough time off. We decided to focus our travels on Africa because that's one of the places neither of us had been before. We started our trip with a 3-day layover in Doha, Qatar. We got a chance to explore some of the desert and dune bash there before flying to Athens and island hopping in the Aegean. We then flew to Cairo and explored Egypt all the way down the Nile to Lake Nasser and back up. Flew to Uganda to hike and climb in the mountains of the Rwenzoris. Did a safari through Kenya and Tanzania. Visited Zanzibar, and then took a long train from Dar es Salaam down to Lusaka. In Zambia, we explored Victoria Falls, and then flew to South Africa for some time in Cape Town and the vineyards, and then on to Madagascar to visit with the lemurs, and lastly, we stopped in Mauritius to have some beach time before returning to the real world. On June 18th at midnight, we boarded a flight to JFK and then on to Doha, Qatar.
بالسلامة لا يسمح باستخدام أي أجهزة إلكترونية أثناء الإقلاع والهبوط باستثناء الأجهزة الإلكترونية الشخصية المحمولة في اليد على أن تكون.
We stepped off the plane straight into the blast furnace that is Qatar. It was regularly 112 or 115 degrees. Fortunately, Qatar is wealthy because of its oil rights, and they were willing to blast air conditioning everywhere. So we ended up hopping cold island to cold island, minimizing our time outdoors. Their museums were particularly impressive, and we really enjoyed the Museum of Islamic Art and the National Museum of Qatar, which had just opened and was shaped like a desert rose, a unique gypsum crystal that's formed in sandy conditions. We wandered through the narrow streets of Souk Waqif and visited the Falcon Market. Since Qatar is an Islamic country, there's no alcohol anywhere, although they are hosting the World Cup in a couple of years, so it should be interesting to see how that plays out. On a Friday morning, Jess and I went out to the artificial island known as the Pearl, and there was absolutely no one there because it was the Friday prayer known as Salah or Salat. We're here at the Pearl in the post-apocalypse. One evening, as temperatures were dipping down to bearable, on a whim we jumped on a boat and did a sunset cruise around the bay. The captain of the boat queued up his favorite After all the heat in Doha, we decided we needed to cool off with some beach time in Greece, so we flew to Athens. We spent all morning exploring Hadrian's Arch, Temple of Zeus, Panathenaic Stadium, National Garden with the Zapeo Hall, Monastiraki Square, the ancient Agora and the Temple of Hephaestus, and then of course we went up to the Parthenon on the Acropolis, but it was very, very crowded. Unfortunately, I had come down with a cold, so I left Jess to do the remainder of the exploring by herself, while I went back to the hotel and caught some rest. Luckily, that recharged my battery enough that we could take a nice stroll up to Philippapo Hill for the sunset. The next morning, we boarded a large ferry headed for Santorini. As the doors opened, you could feel the excitement of everybody ready to disembark on their own adventures on this black volcanic island in the middle of the Aegean Sea. We linked up with a couple of my friends, Mike and Nikos, for the nice hike along the caldera between Fira and Oya. This was one of the best parts of the entire trip. We really enjoyed the 10-kilometer trek, in part because of the views, and also in part because we packed some beers and a whole bottle of ouzo. The following day, we got on another ferry and headed to Paros. Unfortunately, the wind was quite strong that day, leading to quite a bit of swell, and our small catamaran was tossed around like crazy. Mike, unfortunately, wasn't able to keep his lunch, so from that point forward, we called the small catamaran the Vomit Commons. The highlight of Paros was renting mountain bikes and circling the island. We did manage to get lost in the farmland a few times, but we also discovered cool quartz caves used by the ancient Greeks to build their temples. Between the towns of Lefkes and Prodromos is an old Byzantine road. We mountain biked down that, but it was pretty tough. In many places Jess had to walk her bike. So to make up for all that, we grabbed a lunch and then hit the beach. finished out the ride and enjoyed a great dinner on the beach. Jess unfortunately spent a little too long without bug spray reading on the beach later on, and ended up getting severe mosquito bites, which he cooled in the ocean. We wrapped up our Greek island experience on Mykonos. The island is known for its party scene and all the clubs on the beaches there. Now in our mid-30s we weren't much for the club scene, but did get out at least to see the excitement a little bit. The next morning we were up early in Mykonos town with Mike and his wife Hamina. We explored the city, and to our surprise we found the most unlikely of creatures walking down the middle of the street. It was a giant pelican, who we later discovered was named Petros, and is also known as the King of Mykonos. He certainly seemed to have run of the town. We caught a super early flight to Cairo, and then fought off all the taxi driver solicitors to find an Uber to take us to our hotel. We would later discover that this is extremely common, and pretty much anywhere you can find a tourist area, you're going to find dozens of people asking you to purchase something. This actually made our visit to Egypt pretty painful, and I would describe it as our most difficult portion of the trip. The other uniquely difficult thing about Cairo was that for a city of 23 million people, it's shocking that they don't have a single operating traffic light in the whole city. As a result, you find that almost all the cars have dents, and traffic is at a standstill or moving slowly because pedestrians are walking out in front of cars. We would have to budget an hour or more to get anywhere in the city just because of the traffic problems. But all that complaining aside, we did our best to see the sights of ancient Egypt. We started with Giza, of course, and visited the pyramids and the Sphinx. After the Arab Spring Revolution in Egypt in 2011, tourist numbers dropped significantly, and because of that, there are so many people that are depending on the tourist industry, and so few tourists that they will hound you incessantly and follow you block after block trying to sell you carriage rides or trinkets or something else, and it made it extremely difficult to get away from them. Ultimately, we got a carriage ride just to get the guys off our backs and get away from the crowded entranceway. The Egyptians are also very concerned about security, and there are metal detectors at all the hotels and museums and tourist areas, along with armed guards scattered across the city. One day, Jess and I visited the Egyptian Museum, which houses 120,000 different artifacts. There were mummies, sarcophaguses, King Tut's coffin, and gold jewelry. It was all really cool, and the museum itself was quite spectacular. We met up with a couch surfer named Ahmed in Cairo. He was kind enough to help us purchase some train tickets for the locals' price of a few dollars as opposed to the tourist price of $80. He also took us out for a lovely lunch that included pigeons stuffed with rice and green slime called mulukia. The pigeon wasn't bad and tasted like chicken, but man did that green slime taste terrible. While we found the tourist areas pretty overwhelming, once we got off the beaten path, we could see people going about their daily business, and it was very pleasant. They would often invite us over for tea or just a chat. It was incredible to watch the Friday morning prayers when most of the city would step aside from their daily business to pray to Allah. You could hear Allah Akbar echoing down the streets.
Allah
After Cairo, Jess and I caught an overnight train down to Luxor. In the morning, we could see the rising sun over the narrow green strip that hugs the Nile River all the way through the Sahara Desert. I really enjoyed train travel, and it was very nice to share the experience with Jess, who hasn't done an overnight train ride. Even the local kids were extremely friendly and tossed gifts to the train passengers.
Get some good rocks, little kid.
Luxor's West Bank is called the world's best open-air museum, and it was excellent. It was about 110 degrees, unfortunately, but that kept the tourist crowds away. There were only about 10% of the normal winter rush when we were there. We visited Colossi de Memnon, Medinet Habu, which was built for Ramses III, but named after the architect that constructed it. Temple of Hatshepsut and the Valley of the Kings, which is famous for the 62 tombs that were located there, including the King Tut, or King Tutankhamun tomb. The tombs were built between 2000 and 1000 BC, more than 500 years after the Giza pyramids were constructed. They decided to move the tombs to a more secret location because they saw the desecration that had occurred at the Giza pyramids. That was an okay strategy, but only one tomb remained intact from raiders. Can you guess whose that was?
Now when he was a young man, he never thought he'd see people stand in line to see the boy king. How'd you get so funky? Did you do the monkey? Just to see him, I'd taken all my money and bought me a museum. Buried with a donkey.
Prior to the trip, I made contact with a couch surfer who offered up a felucca boat for us to sail on. These are traditional wooden sailing boats used along the Nile to transport goods. Fancying myself a recreational sailor, I was interested to see how these boats compared to the traditional sloop rigs that I was used to. So I arranged a time and place to meet with Saber, and when we approached, a gentleman came up to us and acted like he knew us very well, so I assumed it had been him. I wanted to confirm this, so I held up my phone and I said, "Are you Saber? Have we been texting?" And he said, "Yes." So I said, "Great, can you show us your felucca?" To my surprise, he said, "No, that can wait. We really should take a nice tour around town with his carriage." I was a little suspicious, but he insisted that the market was fantastic and we needed to take a ride to go visit it. So Jess and I piled into the carriage, and away we went. When we arrived at his friend's shop, it was clear that we weren't in the right place, and the person taking us on this tour either wasn't Saber, or it was Saber, but he just wanted our money. I insisted that he take us back to where we started, and if he didn't have a boat, then we weren't interested. He apologized profusely and then pulled out his phone to call his brother to get the boat ready. When we returned, we eventually broke free from him and started leaving. He told us we had to pay for the carriage ride, but that's when a gentleman came up and said, "Hello, I'm Saber." So we were lied to and then kidnapped for a short period of time, but all in all it was great that we finally found Saber. He did in fact have a boat, and the next day we arranged to have a lovely sail. Actually, Jess and I both took turns sailing the felucca, and we had dinner and beers aboard, so it was really a wonderful experience. Definitely the highlight of the entire trip to Egypt.
Slide feet up the street, bend your back, shift your arm, then you pull it back. It's hard, you know. So strike a pose on a Cadillac. If you wanna find all the cops, they're hanging out in Gucci and all the cops in the donuts up say, walk like an Egyptian, walk like an Egyptian.
Like sailing through the island.
The next day, we traveled by train south again to Aswan. We took in the sights of Lake Nasser, the High Dam, the Temple of Play, and a few other sites before settling into our dungeon hostel. The following day, we were up before 3 a.m. to drive 4 hours south through the Sahara Desert to Abu Simbel, a temple complex constructed by Ramses II to commemorate his victory in the Battle of Kadesh. The drive across the uninhabited, barren landscape, nearly to the Sudanese border, is potentially volatile based on the number of police checkpoints that we had to go through. In 1960, Egypt started to construct the High Dam in Aswan that created Lake Nasser. This enormous artificial lake would have submerged the original Abu Simbel temples, so UNESCO spearheaded an effort to move them to higher ground. Teams wielding a range of saws dismantled the entire temple and reconstructed it in an artificial mountain. You can see the cut marks in the facade and the interior, but the workmanship was very impressive. It wasn't crowded and the interiors were spectacular with engraving and statues depicting the pharaoh worshipping and providing offerings to the god. After all that time in Egypt, Jess actually got pretty good at identifying these different deities. Osiris, Horus, Isis, Hathor, Anubis, Ra, Nut, and so many others. I personally could never keep them straight, but Jess is amazing in that way. At the very end of our time in Aswan, David was nice enough to get us freshly crushed sugarcane juice as we were departing from his hostel. We caught the overnight train back to Cairo and linked back up with Ahmed to get some fatira pizza, smoke shisha, and then take in the sunset before heading out. He was also kind enough to invite us over to his family's house to enjoy a lunch with them. After a painful red-eye flight, Jess and I landed in Entebbe, Uganda at 3 a.m. We got a taxi into the capital city of Kampala and immediately boarded a bus to Kasese. The ride was 9 hours and they blasted music the entire time. As a former British protectorate, Uganda was a welcome change from Egypt. Generally, people spoke decent English, the temperatures were much lower, and the religious customs were less foreign to us. We settled into our hotel in Kasese, a sleepy town along the western border of the country. From here we would launch a day trip down to Queen Elizabeth National Park and then move up to the Rwenzori Mountains for our big 8-day trek. While Kasese didn't boast any major tourist attractions, it was wonderful just to walk around town and interact with the locals. They were all friendly, and hordes of them didn't come up to solicit us at every opportunity. Around town we would see kids playing soccer, and generally the people seemed quite happy. Some local guys were even thrilled to show us their chicken butchering operation. The sister of a friend got me in touch with a driver in Kasese, who then hired another guide to take us around Queen Elizabeth National Park. We started our day off with a driving safari. During this game drive, we four-wheeled around the grassland, spotting many warthogs, cobs, water bucks, hippos, and buffaloes. We also watched a wild leopard and her cub climb up an euphorbia tree and settle in for an early morning nap.
Uganda,
Around lunchtime we went to the Kazinga Channel, snacked on fresh-caught catfish, and took a motorboat cruise around the busy riverbanks. We admired the bachelor buffaloes and hippos cooling themselves. There were many ibis, hammerheads, kingfishers, herons, and weaver birds, flitting and hunting along the marshlands. A crocodile guarded her nest from an African monitor lizard, and the elephants came down to drink by the watering hole. As we crossed the equator on our way back to Kasese, I asked Morris, our driver, and Dan, our guide, if they would be interested in playing a couple rounds of pool, since I heard from a friend that this is all the rage in Uganda. Dan was kind enough to take me up on the offer, and we had an epic battle of Uganda versus USA. The US was up 4-0, but somehow ended up losing 5-6. I blame the funny home rules and the malt beer. The next day we met up with the Rwenzori trekking services guy and went up the hill to Kalembe, where we'd start the largest adventure of the trip. Well before we left the United States, we booked an 8-day trek through the Rwenzori Mountains National Park to Margarita Peak. Its shrinking glaciated peaks along the equator are some of the last. The glaciers, along with the Rwenzori rainfall, which is 2.5 meters a year, represent the true source of the Nile River. It wasn't until 1888 that a team led by Henry Stanley even confirmed there were snow-capped peaks in the center of Africa. These mountains of the moon, as they're called, are masked in fog and clouds nearly continuously, so it is very difficult to appreciate their height above the Rift Valley. However, after gaining 12,000 feet over 6 days, I can tell you they tower inside those white wisps. Part of the fun of hiking in the Rwenzoris is working your way through the different climate zones. We began in steep farmland with cows, chickens, and goats cluttering the trail, with the locals waving us on as we embarked on our adventure. We passed avocado, coffee, and banana trees until we hit a wall of vegetation marking the park boundary. From there we had multiple 1,000-meter plus climbing days. We saw a three-horned chameleon and blue monkeys in the first day in the Afro-Montane rainforest. I fashioned a lightweight trekking stick in the bamboo zone. And then the heather trees were draped with Usnea beard lichens, and sphagnum moss coated all the surfaces in the heather zone. The giant lobelias were replaced by giant groundsel in the alpine zone. It was hard-fought vertical for sure, but the scenery helped take the pain down a couple notches. But make no mistake, this was extremely difficult. The trek definitely kicked both of our asses. I feel like I could write a book on my experiences in the Rwenzoris, and each chapter would be titled a different injury, illness, or affliction. Between Jess and I, over the course of the 8 days, we may have contracted every sickness known to mankind. It was fortunate we had 11 to 12 hours to sleep at night because we only managed to do so about half the time. Day after day we were treated to viciously steep jungle trails, ankle-deep mud bogs, snow-covered boulder fields, and exposed wet rock sections. It's really tough to explain how exhausting and demoralizing it is to slog miles perpetually jumping from wet log to muddy rock to wobbly grass tuft in rubber gum boots. In the Afro-Montane zone, mud. In the bamboo zone, mud. In the heather zone, mud. In the alpine areas, the mud pits were coated in ice but not frozen enough to hold a person's weight. After day 1, my hip flexor was on fire. Day 2 brought nausea and stomach aches. Day 3, I was feverish and hid in my sleeping bag for nearly 15 hours. Day 4, my cold had me coughing all day. Day 5, I had GI issues. Day 6, I had sleep deprivation delusions. Day 7, some chafing problems, and day 8, I blackened my toenails. It was a tough go. Through all this, Jess quietly endured the trekking misery, while still battling her own 3-week-old cold. She was there to help me with my fever, cough, blisters, scrapes, and other ailments. I tried to reciprocate as best I could, but it's hard to beat a nurse at nursing. She did an awesome job.
Jess and I and our guide Henry are headed up to the pass here. Day 4. And we have a serene alpine environment here in the Rwenzoris in Uganda. Getting pretty close to 14,000 feet. We're breathing, but my cold seems to be going away, so that's good. And we're continuing in good style.
At the end of day 4, we reach Hunwick's camp. Many of the floorboards in Hunwick's sleeping cabin and dining room flex under your weight. They don't creak much because there are healthy 1/2 inch gaps between them, allowing plenty of below freezing ventilation at night. The squat toilets include a spring-loaded flap to prevent a breeze up your backside, but if overloaded, you get the chill plus the smell. The porters and guides kept to their own set of structures, which were easily located by the smoke stream rising in the distance. All the upper camps included a camp stove in the dining area. These would naturally be assembly points for the group and all the wet, smelly clothes. We would sip tea and recount the day's challenges and highlights. Besides us, there was a very serious and well-equipped German couple in their late 40s, who mostly kept to themselves, and Thomas, a 57-year-old South African who lacked all emotion. Sadly, there wasn't much group chemistry, and we principally kept to our separate conversations even at the dinner table and in the same sleeping cabin.
We've arrived at Hunwick's camp. Night 4. Tomorrow we'll be headed up to Margarita Camp, which is where we launch for the summit, if we so desire to go for it. But I'm feeling a little bit better today, and I think we'll see how it goes. Look out, Margarita Camp. There's a new cowgirl in town.
First crampons.
First time?
First time.
They work better in the snow.
On the 6th day, it was our summit day. Whatever is the opposite of a weather window is what struck our climbing group on our summit day. We woke at 1:45 a.m. to light rain. By 2 a.m. it had transitioned to snow, which continued for most of the following 12 hours. It might not have been too bad had it not been a few degrees above freezing down low, so all the rock was wickedly slick and treacherous. It got even worse up higher, where it turned to freezing, fog, and saturated the fixed lines. Jess and I were accompanied by our guides Henry and Remy Joe, who patiently walked us through the granite labyrinth, helped us ascend the fixed rope, and placed us in the middle of a 4-person rope team across Stanley Glacier. I started fearing for Jess, since she's inexperienced with high-altitude alpinism, and conditions were tough. We talked about options as the sun started to lighten our foggy world, but Henry pushed us on. Jess got up one pitch of the 70-degree Margarita Glacier ascent before wisely deciding to retreat. I verified my hall pass at the belay ledge, and Henry, Remajo, and I pushed higher. 3 pitches up, we roped up on steep bulletproof ice, climbed to the ridge where we caught the Germans, crawled through the spectacular ice cave that forms from the winds, ascended another fixed line, and scrambled with our crampons scratching the granite blocks. It was definitely hard going in adverse conditions, but I was feeling strong for the first time in many days. There's just something about summit days that focuses your body on the task at hand.
Well, we're on the final few feet of Margarita Peak. As you can see, the weather is fantastic. A little snow, but yeah, I'm really glad Jess turned around, and we'll finish it off and then head home. This pile of rocks marks the border between Uganda over there and the Democratic Republic of Congo over there. The border agent isn't here today, but I have 1 foot in the Congo and 1 foot in Uganda at the highest point in both countries. Woo!
At 1:30 p.m. I walked into the dining cabin and was happy to see smiling Jess warming her feet by the fire. On the 6th night, a powerful thunderstorm filled the valley with rumbling, echoing thunder that rattled camp. The heavy rain deepened the mud by several inches and coated the upper mountains in a couple of additional inches of snow. We started our 7th day exhausted from the summit day the day before, so the going was slow. After 10 minutes of putting in maximum effort to go a few hundred feet, you feel defeated. Now imagine that over 9 hours. The mud isn't just in the lowlands either. It clings to every surface and every slope. We would climb 45-degree pitches, and every step was ankle-deep mud. Eventually we got high enough that the snow at least covered the mud, and we could hop from rock to rock in our gum boots. At this point we had passed the German couple and the South African, so we were trekking through the virgin snow, admiring the different paw prints. The world was foggy and calm, with that special kind of quiet that only comes from a fresh snowfall. The mountain range was quickly liquefying though, which produced a new set of wonders and terrors. Lower down, all the peaks were streaming with splendid waterfalls, but it also swole the rivers to frightening levels. Many times I was left wondering if the river migrated into the trail, or if the Ugandans chose to construct the trail in the river. Our guide Henry did a wonderful job of pointing out the submerged rocks to use as stepping stones, and held Jess's hand as she crossed the strongest of the torrents. This saved her all except once from flopping in the snowmelt, fortunately only soaking her arms and backpack. The rest of the time Jess was disco dancing like a horse on roller skates, which was both frightening and entertaining for the spectators. This trek was only possible thanks to the top-notch guiding, order, and cooking support. Breakfast and dinners were 2-course meals with porridge or soup to start, then a gourmet plate of eggs, toast, sausage, bacon, and/or pancakes. Dinners often included things like beef stew with squash, a rice or a lentil stew, spaghetti, and other things. Lunches were provided to us at the beginning of each day and would typically include a juice box, apple, and sandwich or potato salad. The porters would leapfrog us around noon carrying our 20-kilogram bag of clothes and sleeping gear. Rwenzori Trekking Services uses 600 porters to man their operation, and at any given time this army is stretched out across the Rwenzori mountain range. Without that support, the 80-kilometer trek would have been impossible for us. By the time we would arrive in camp, the special porters would have hot water and thermoses ready for tea or hot chocolate and biscuits laid out. The guides were responsible for cooking and would serve our dinner before preparing their own. They would be up at 5 a.m. to start the breakfast prep, cooking over basic charcoal stoves that would fill camp with an aroma of wintertime. Most of the porters are from the small mountain town of Kalembe, where you begin the trek. They are only paid $5 a day as a porter, $10 a day as a quarter plus cook, and $20 a day as a guide. But it's a huge boost to the local economy. RTS employs hundreds of porters, and a couple dozen will line up outside the gate to be selected for work each morning. As you start and end the trek in town, all the school children wave and cheer, and wish their parents a sad farewell or a happy return. At the end of the trek, we were relieved to get back to civilization. Jess and I had left more than $1,600 in cash buried 3 bags deep in a locked hotel room, where they said it would be safe. Only Rwenzori Trekking Services accountant, Jean, had the keys to this room. When we returned, our money was gone. I was floored because I had so much trust in RTS and their glowing reputation. I finally concluded Gene was a lone bad actor who had done the calculations. Even if caught, the cash would be equivalent to multiple years of income, and it would be worth the risk of jail time. Jean was the only person who knew where the money was in the bag. She saw how much Jess and I were carrying, and she didn't follow the RTS protocol to secure an account for the cash, which we didn't know about. Apparently they did have a safe, but we weren't told about it. After the discovery, I asked if the police were coming. They said we needed to go down to the station to get the cops because they don't own their own car. So we jumped in the van, went down to the Kalembe police station, and entered an official complaint of the robbery. I jokingly decried, "I am the complainer." It took quite some time, but eventually we gathered up 4 officers and drove them in a van back up to the hostel. The female plainclothes station chief told the other officers that they didn't need to bring their assault weapons into the van when they had already piled in. So there we were, sitting in a van on a live police hunt. We stopped at the hostel gate so the security officer could check our temperatures, ensuring we didn't have Ebola, and then the police interrogated our witnesses. The following day, we recorded and signed our official statements regarding the robbery with the Criminal Investigation Department. Gene didn't confess to the crime but spent the night in jail. There was disbelief and disappointment on all levels of RTS and the police force regarding the theft. After a days-long heated conversation with the company owner, an Australian gentleman, an RTS representative honorably reimbursed us for our loss just a couple of hours before our flight to Nairobi. After the Rwenzoris and the robbery, it was great to relax in Kenya. With a population of 6.5 million, there's plenty to do in Kenya's capital. We visited the elephant orphanage that locates desperate baby elephants by air or ground, nurses them into adulthood, and reintroduces them into the wild. The process takes 5 to 10 years depending on when the wild elephants re-accept them, but with a lifespan of 70 years, it's worth the investment. Surprisingly, many of the 16 elephants at the David Seldrick Wildlife Trust are believed to be orphaned because of illegal hunting and ivory trading, a problem that certainly must be addressed from both the supply and demand perspective. Next, we overfilled an Uber with 3 random Germans and headed out to the giraffe center, where we fed food pellets to an 8-year-old Nubian giraffe, Ed, and an 18-year-old giraffe named Kelly. From our perch on the 2nd-story balcony, the giraffes' long tongues would slurp the treats from our hands. It was really quite fun. The Rothschild giraffes are critically endangered, and there are less than 2,000 living in the wild, up from an estimated 250 in 2010. Let's hope the trend continues in the right direction. Prior to departing on our 10-day safari, my brother Josh and my parents Dan and Molly and my cousin Annalise joined us in Nairobi. We walked over to the Nairobi National Museum and Snake Park. My brother was particularly fond of the African rock python, chameleon, and black mamba, but my mom, not so much. There were exhibits which covered the local bird and mammal populations, the country's history, and the birth and evolution of the Homo sapiens species. More recently, Kenya was visited by the Arabs in the 7th century and then gained the attention of the British, Dutch, and Portuguese in the 16th and 19th centuries, resulting in the British East African Protectorate in 1895. Kenya gained independence in 1964, which led to years of oppression, tribal wars, ethnic violence, and authoritarianism. I get the sense that many things are still unsettled here, but Nairobi is quiet and peaceful compared to Cairo and Kampala. It was nice to comfortably walk down the street, only shrugging off the occasional beggar or solicitor. We began our budget safari through Kenya and Tanzania on a wet, rainy day. Typically, you can expect a 10-day safari to run upwards of $5,000, but we got this trip for about $2,000. The company is cutting prices by loading 15 people into a beat-up two-wheel drive fish tank named Simba, or Lion in Kiswahili, having everyone help prepare and clean dishes and camping each night. Honestly, I didn't mind the price cuts except for the piece of shit vehicle, which can only climb in first gear, and on the second day was stuck in the mud for more than 2 hours. It would have been longer had a tractor not come by to pull us out. There are 42 tribes in Kenya. The region around Masai Mara has a very traditional tribe known as the Maasai. The men of this tribe used to be required to go into the bush for 10 years and kill a lion before they could return to the village and be selected a wife by the chief. Any additional wives were chosen at the discretion of the individual. The Maasai raise cattle and goats in the Great Rift Valley, wrapped in bright red and orange cloaks, supposedly because it looks like fire and keeps the lions away. It is common for them to bleed the cattle by puncturing their necks to prepare drinks of milk and blood. Think of them like cow vampires. As you drive through this region, many Maasai are keeping watch over their prize animals and defending them from encroaching predators, while others are tour guides and make beaded bracelets and paint wood sculptures to sell to tourists. Once inside the Masai Mara National Reserve, thousands of wildebeest spotted the horizon as we rattled our junker Simba across the grassland. At the time we were visiting, they would be there another 4 months before migrating south to the Serengeti to mate. We saw herds of zebras, families of elephants, giraffes, mongooses, and a leopard in a tree. There were bachelor buffaloes, a jackal, and 3 lions. On our way out of the park, we ran into the famous 5 brothers, a well-fed group of cheetahs that hunt as a team. They lazily walked between us and another vehicle, ignoring us entirely, and out onto the plains to hunt. It was a wonderful day in the bush.
Hear the drums echoing tonight. She hears only whispers of some quiet conversation. She's coming in 12:30 flight.
At 2,000 meters above sea level, the dew sparkled in the chilly morning air for hours before the sun could burn it off. Our rainy streak was finally broken, and we were treated to a gorgeous game drive through Lake Nakuru National Park. Our safari truck Simba meandered clockwise around the swollen lake, and we watched the baby baboons cling to the bellies of their mother, vervet or blue ball monkeys jumping between branches, and the water bucks knocking antlers to get their ladies. Rothschild's giraffes and zebras were out in numbers as well. The lake has no outlet, so it has grown salty through evaporation. When heavy rains a few years ago raised the water level, it killed many of the yellow acacia and euphorbia trees along the shoreline, giving it a ghostly appearance. The pelicans, cormorants, and pink flamingos don't seem to mind though, and they happily eat in the shallows. We were very fortunate to see both black and white rhinos in the park. The black rhinos are quite rare and difficult to spot because they graze on leaves, not grass, so they tend to be hidden in denser shrub foliage. It was summertime and the Kenyan school children also visited the park. We jockeyed most of the day with dozens of yellow school buses packed with smiling kids and their school blazer. It's tough to say if they were more excited to see the animals or a bunch of Mzungu tourists. For months, my wonderful mother had been planning fun ways to bring education and joy to the local children in Kenya. Foregoing clothing, she filled her bag with 6 deflated soccer balls, half a dozen English and Kiswahili kids' books, bubbles, balloons, craft supplies, pens, markers, etc. During our trip, we visited an orphanage for a few hours and shared these things with the children. The little ones loved the balls and bubbles, and the older ones were keen to take on the Mzungu opponents on the football pitch. Josh ran a great race against the local kids, and then we played a nice pickup soccer game. The pitch was littered with kids' shoes and shirts and whatever else they felt like discarding on the field. It was a little bit dangerous, but all in all, great fun. The Mzungu team put up a good fight, but ultimately fell 2-0 in a good-spirited game with a diverse collection of players and skills, from ages 10 to 61. I clumsily put a few shots up, none were on frame, but I did add a few holes to the bushes behind the goal. It felt great to get a little exercise after being trapped in the safari mobile for 4 days. That evening we shared dinner with the 106 orphans before they sang choir songs for us. Ironically, because the number of visitors from on-the-go tours that come through, the orphanage is pretty well off. It was even more gratifying to pick out a kid on the streets and toss him or her a soccer ball. The 10-year-old boy I first selected caught the ball, drew a huge smile, held the ball above his head like it fell from the gods, and ran screaming down the dirt street to his friends, who all were losing their minds. Sadly, those kids didn't start up a soccer game right there and then, but ran past the kid with the ball toward our departing truck, looking for gifts of their own. Looks like they're going to have to learn how to share. The next day we were driving through the fertile highlands. There are acres of patchwork tea plantations on the hillsides and many fruit and vegetable stands along the roadside. Farming families were selling their latest produce. We pulled over and got a round of grilled corn for everyone. It was only 50 cents a pop. In the process we spotted a few kids by the corn grill and tossed out another soccer ball. They, again, lost their minds and went screaming into the distance. Then the brakes on Simba failed, and our driver had to pour water on the rotors until they cooled off enough that we could continue our journey. We crossed the border into Tanzania, as they call it, and cruised through an interesting landscape that inspired the Lion King movies. We then set up camp along Lake Victoria and had a few cocktails before settling in for the night. In the morning, we wandered around the small fishing village and admired all the wares for sale. We especially appreciated the thousands of pounds of dried fish that the local fishermen dry on nets. Blood was smeared across the windows of our safari vehicle. It was zebra blood, burst from the swollen rear ends of slain tsetse flies. We battled dozens of them communally using empty soda bottles, flip-flops, and bare-handed judo chops along the 80 miles of washboard dirt road on the western side of the Serengeti National Park. The park is immense. We gawked at the pods of hippos, nostrils deep in the stagnant river, a pride of lions stalking and narrowly missing a Thompson gazelle, the hyenas hidden in a thicket, tiny deer called dik-diks, and 7 ostriches were walking together across the savannah, giraffes nibbling the leaves of the flat-top acacia trees, and bewildered wildebeests who didn't make it up to the green grasses of Masai Mara. There were also a collection of marabou storks fishing from a tree. At night, in our fenceless camp, we identified the glowing eyes of distant animals, mostly gazelles, as nearby hyenas communicated to each other with human-like woos and yells. These wonderful experiences came at the cost of rattling in Simba for many, many hours at 20 miles an hour, breathing dust from faster, better-equipped land cruisers that zipped around us like tsetse flies on a zebra. We snacked on local sugarcane as we finished our travels in the national park. As we traversed the rough road on the way to Ngorongoro Crater, the heat of the day had spawned a few dust devils, but the local Maasai didn't seem to bat an eye. We set up camp on the chilly rim of the Ngorongoro Crater with dozens of other tour groups. After our eggplant pasta dinner and evening briefing, we were surprised to find many zebras strolling through camp eating the short grass by our tents. The following morning, a heavy fog covered the campsite, but once down in the crater, visibility was good and we found many lions, jackals, geese, wildebeest, ostriches, gazelles, hippos, warthogs, and the other usual suspects. We were in 2 land cruisers with pop-up roofs for a change. It was fun bounding around the crater basin with the cold morning wind in our faces. Streams of single-file wildebeest and zebras were migrating to their watering holes where the lions were patiently waiting. It was funny to watch the zebras take turns scratching their faces and bellies on the granite rocks. You could definitely make out the satisfaction on their faces. How a family of hippos ever made the journey over the 1,500-foot rim into the crater, I won't ever know. I don't think they will be leaving anytime soon. That evening we drove outside the crater to Arusha, to a combination snake park campsite. What could possibly go wrong with that? I wandered the grounds admiring the spitting cobras, African pythons, and green mambas with the Kilimanjaro beer in hand. I appreciated the Kilimanjaro beer slogan, "If you can't climb it, drink it." Afterwards, in a well-decorated tourist bar, Jess and I posted a Qatari Rial with our J&J Africa 2019 hashtag and wondered if we'd be back in 30 years to still find it there. Back in Nairobi, we picked up some treats and then celebrated Josh's birthday at an Ethiopian restaurant. Our bumpy prop plane landed in a sea of rusty sheet metal roofs known as Zanzibar City. About all I knew about the island a year ago was that Jack Black got takeout here.
What's your favorite position? That's cool with me. It's not my favorite, but I'll do it for you. What's your favorite dish? I'm not gonna cook it, but I'll order it from Zanzibar. And then I'm gonna love you completely.
Turns out this little place was a major center of spice, ivory, and slave trade for the Arabs for centuries, after the Omanis gained control of it from the Portuguese in 1698. We visited the highly informational and stomach-turning slave chambers. The personal accounts were especially powerful. I learned a lot. For instance, enslavement was primarily conducted by certain local tribes, for example the Yao, who were loyal to the Omanis and warring with other tribes. The slaves would be traded owner to owner while being marched in caravans for up to 3 years to the coast from as far away as the Democratic Republic of Congo. Punishment techniques included using a tree trunk yoked around their necks. On the sea passage, they were shackled in a squatted position, unable to stand or lay down for 7 or more days, in their own feces. Then, when they got cholera, slaves were killed in the Zanzibar Bay, as opposed to paying the unloading fee, and bloated corpses were common on the local beaches. Slaves were widely used for carrying ivory tusks out of Africa, which were used to make billiard balls and piano keys. The British were patrolling the seas for Arabian slave ships after its legalization in 1876. But it was one of the most dangerous jobs in the Navy and often resulted in casualties on both sides. After that cheerful tour, we went out to the beach and watched the locals play soccer and do flips in the sand. There were a number of fishermen set up with the day's catch, and we picked out some shrimp for them to barbecue for our dinner. We paired that with veggie samosas, bean falafel, and tandoori duck, an odd but tasty combo. On the second day, we rented rickety bicycles to explore outside Stone Town. This isn't very common, probably because the riding was tough. We had to dodge scooters, bicycles, buses, trucks, rickshaws, all traveling at vastly different speeds. Originally, we hoped to go to Mangapwani, but the conditions turned worse at Babubu when the pavement ended and the dust started. We cut our plans short and biked down to the beach. In the last 50 feet, I downshifted to help me climb off the beach, but I dropped my chain and it cammed between the cassette and hub. A couple locals watched my back wheel come to a grinding halt. I tried to free it with no luck. The Zanzibaris offered to help using the only tool available, a machete. I didn't think it could be removed without taking off the back wheel, but after a few minutes they had pried the chain free. African ingenuity at its finest. In hindsight, we probably overpaid for a long boat trip to the Pangae Island sandbar and a few attractions on Canggu or Prison Island. In the bright sun the day before, it sounded like a wonderful idea, but 16 hours later, when we made landfall on the narrow spit of sand, a fierce squall was closing in on us. After 15 minutes, the rain came pounding down with 25-mile-an-hour winds. 100 or so, obviously pre-booked tourists, fled for cover as the boat and cooking teams pooled resources to hold a rain tarp over one of the tents. It was quite the scene. Once the wind died off a bit, I grabbed Jess and the snorkeling gear and we headed to sea. The snorkeling was a fun exploratory experience as usual. The coral, like most places, was badly bleached because of climate change, and people like Jess and I who used the wrong sunblock. On the trip over to Prison Island, we came across a pod of dolphins slicing through the glassy water. The captain killed the engine, and we watched them for a while. The prison on Prison Island wasn't very interesting, but the island was covered in peacocks, aldabra tortoises, and at least one dik-dik. The tortoises each had their age painted on the shells, and we spotted many older than 100 years old, and one who was 194. On our last day on Zanzibar, I did a couple of dives. The second dive of the day was the Great Northern Wreck, a 240-foot cable-laying ship that sank on Pugu Chambwala Reef in 1902 in about 12 meters of water. For 50 years, the bow rose out over the water before being cut up with scrap steel. Now coral clings to the submerged hull and mass, and fish filled the bulkheads. A moray eel had taken up residence with puffer, trigger, and parrotfish there. There is also a huge mantis shrimp out in the open, raising up like a cobra to defend itself. From Zanzibar, Jess and I caught the Kilimanjaro 3 catamaran to Dar es Salaam. The seas were rough as we plowed into the wind, and many people got sick again. We managed to make the 2-hour sunset sail okay, and linked up with the couchsurfing host Saeed at the port. Saeed and I had been talking via WhatsApp for many months, and he was trying his best to teach me a little Kiswahili. It wasn't going very well though, as I was so distracted with planning the travel. We taxied in gridlock traffic for over an hour to get to a small neighborhood. When we arrived, it was very dark, and I didn't notice with my nitrogen-heavy, scuba-corrupted brain that I left my camera bag in the car. 2 minutes after we left the taxi, I realized my mistake and panicked. Luckily, Saeed knew the driver as a friend of a friend, so he called him back and we jumped on a couple of bodabodas, or motorbikes, to give chase on a bumpy dirt road. We caught the car and retrieved the camera. Crisis averted once again. We visited nice beaches in Dar es Salaam, but the highlight of our time there was watching Saeed's mother, Zahuru, take Jess under her wing and teach her how to cook mini Tanzanian meals over the charcoal stove. Jess learned to cook banana chicken, egg chapati, steamed plantains, and pilau, a spicy rice dish. Saeed did his best to bridge the language barrier, but hand gestures and demonstrations went a long way too. Zahuru's 16-year-old daughter was off at boarding school, so I think Jess was acting as the Mzungu surrogate daughter for 3 days. We made sure to always compliment our head chef. She got a kick out of that. We wanted to give them a nice gift for hosting us, so we got a fancy new blender to replace the small cracked one they used. Zahuru celebrated with an African ululation, a high-pitched yell trilled by the tongue. Oh, it's a big one.
Yeah, she likes the new one.
It was great. Zahuru also took great pride in dressing Jess in African kangas made by their neighbor. This, in addition to the leather sandals Saeed gave us from his now shuttered footwear business, made Jess look like she was a local. Sadly, times were tough for the family. Their father had a stroke recently and wasn't able to move much. Saeed had his business shut down, and his mother was doing her best to collect food from the farm to bring back to the homestead. But they always maintained a positive attitude. I remember Saeed happily showing me that he had a water pump at his home, and that water would show up 24/7 here, something he was very proud of. Sadly, after 3 days, we had to say goodbye to Saeed and his mother, and Jess and I boarded the express Tazara train from Dar es Salaam to Kapiri Poshi. The express designation indicated the trip would only take 53 hours, not months. The train was remarkably slow and the track horrendously rough. I never experienced anything like it before. We'd often cross a gap, a badly gauged spot, or a dented rail that would bang all the loose train cars together and send us tumbling. We arrived in Dar es Salaam 3 days before the train departed, so we had to purchase third-class tickets. They said along the way first-class passengers would depart and we could get spots in the sleeping cabin. It was risky, but the $450 flight alternative made the gamble worth it. At least I thought so. After the security checkpoint, we boarded and were placed in a car packed with crying infants, reciprocating fans, and unreclinable seats directly across from two nice Swahili ladies. It was hot and noisy. I worried that I had sentenced us to 2 nights and 1,800 kilometers of fitful sleep. Every orange shirt wearing train representative who passed I made acutely aware of our desire to pay to be upgraded. They all said we'd see when people dropped, but I was surprised at the laissez-faire approach to booking. After 4.5 hours, we reached our first stop. It was dark, so I couldn't see who departed. Jess and I were in the dining car when Tazara, a person with the clipboard, came by. I asked if we could move to the first class. He said, no, maybe in Mbeya, tomorrow at 1 p.m. But our luck turned at 11 p.m., just as we were starting to drift off when somebody found us spots in the male and female sleeper cabins for a modest bribe, and we were able to lay down for the night. What a relief. Not entirely above board, but laying horizontal was heavenly. At least the train had meals for $2.50, and you could get $1.50 beers if you braved the raucous bar car. So for 53 hours, we watched 3 sunsets on the landscape of Tanzania and Zambia drift past. Townships, burning crop fields, thatch-roofed homesteads, women fetching firewood and water balanced on their heads, and jumping and yelling children crowded around football field with crooked 3-stick goals. It was quite the experience, and certainly the low point for Jess. She ended up with a crying infant in her sleeper car and hardly got any sleep at all. On the other side of the train trip, we got a hotel, and then decided to have a more relaxing day in Lusaka as opposed to piling on another mega travel day. With the exception of being surrounded by so many people at the bus station, and not having any cellular data anywhere in the country, we found Lusaka to be very pleasant. There were broad sidewalks, tree-lined streets, quaint delis, not that much trash, and friendly people with decent English pretty much everywhere. The following day we loaded up for a 9-hour bus ride to Livingston. The bus started by a woman standing up and giving a Christian sermon, with Bible readings and asking everybody to bow our heads in silent prayer. In Livingstone, we set up our tent at the best hostel in Zambia, Jolly Boys, and cracked open some Mosi beer and had a poolside barbecue called a braai. The steak was especially spectacular. Victoria Falls is considered one of the 7 natural wonders of the world, where 1,000 cubic meters per second of water from the Zambezi River plunges 108 meters into the deep canyon. The enormous mile-long curtain of water exists primarily in the rainy season, November to April, as the water from the Congo forest works its way around through Mozambique to the Indian Ocean. When we arrived to the national park, many of the basalt cliffs were dry on the Zambian side because of natural water levels and untold gallons redirected into the hydroelectric plant. The Zimbabwe side looked far more misty. The knife-edge bridge that we easily crossed would normally be drenched in mist during the flood season. Fortunately, at low flow rates on the Zambezi, a small infinity pool forms near Livingston Island at the edge of Victoria Falls. The Devil's Pool, as it's known, can be accessed through guided trips from the Zambian side. We just walked along the dry riverbed to Livingston Island and then waded out to the Devil's Pool, located at the edge of a 93-meter precipice. A sizable rock lip keeps you from being swept over the falls, but the views from the spot are killer. You see the massive main falls dropping away into the canyon and billowing mist back onto the other side, which creates a double rainbow and smaller waterfalls on the opposite side of the canyon. It's simply wonderful watching the power of nature from this perch. But I won't lie, peering over the edge definitely gives you a scary rush, and you double check your footing.
blame it on next same place that we have been. Don't never find too late in the weekend. And I think
Below Victoria Falls, a deep canyon zigzags through the basalt with world-renowned fifth-class whitewater. Jess and I found ourselves down there one morning in a 16-foot raft, crashing through 8-foot standing waves and riding powerful wave train roller coasters with big grins.
Arrête de me les plaguer, bah quoi sur 50-50, I'm a 50 Amen, it's a mina one come fast, see you're independent. Let's go 50-50, I got it.
Oko mundu bana nabo independent. Oh 50-50.
Got the man who's so bad.
Tell her now labo funny 50.
Go,
Hola 50-50.
got the man plaguer, bah.
Tell her now labo funny 50. I got I'm a 50-50.
Agna muto so ngwala. Keep on now labo so 50. Pink man.
I'm not level zone wala. 50 down, no excuse.
Our experienced guide, Babyface, snaked us through most of the pool drop run, but not even he could keep us from flipping in the notorious Oblivion Rapid. We knew it was going to be rough when he walked around the boat and double-checked everyone's PFDs were nice and tight before dropping into the hole. We stood no chance as the wave of water rolled us instantly onto the port side. A swim is definitely part of the experience when running the Zambezi, though.
My style is the bomb, the dang, diggy, diggy. Karumo, I don't play with the bomb, the dang, diggy, diggy. My style is the bomb, the dang, diggy, diggy. Karumo, I don't play with the bomb, the dang, diggy, diggy.
Go now, we sit down and watch your man a live. Watch your man a war now, who a roll big. Sit down and a plan fi come put man average. Remember when you dig hole that hole you fi dig. Certain little boy we all stop deal with. Claim say them a friend and them bad mind your friend.
My style is the bomb, the dang, diggy, diggy. Karumo, I don't play.
We celebrated surviving the whitewater trip with some cocktails on a sunset cruise on the top of the falls. Jess and I arrived in Cape Town, South Africa pretty late, and it was raining. I managed to drive without hitting anything all the way to our Airbnb. The following day, sunup to sundown, Cape Town wowed us. We hiked the India Venstre route through the Finbo's vegetation to the top of Table Mountain. It included a handful of Class 3 moves that spiced things up a bit, but nothing a few Rwenzori trekkers couldn't handle.
Hold on, no, I've gotta go. There's no starting over, no new beginnings. Time raises on. Just gotta keep on keeping on. Gotta keep on going, looking straight out on the road. Can't worry about what's behind you, what's coming for you further up the road. Try not to hold on to what is gone. I try to do right what is wrong. I try to keep on keeping on.
We caught the tram back down, visited Walkabout neighborhood that has all the colorful houses, and then went to the Castle of Good Hope.
Calling out for me. These shackles I made in the town to be free.
Next we visited the District 6 Museum, which is very educational. Thousands of people were displaced in the 1960s when District 6 was decreed a white neighborhood in Cape Town. The homes and shops of black, colored, and Asian Cape Townians were completely demolished to make way for the city's expansion using apartheid tactics. It really is mind-boggling how the British Parliament pioneered anti-slavery legislation in 1807 and 1833 to abolish the slave trade and then abolish slavery entirely. But their colony still applied the harshest racist segregation legislation to maintain white supremacy through 1994. The next few days we cruised around the Cape Peninsula, visiting Hout Bay, Muizenberg, and Simonstown. We really appreciated the freedom of the car, paying with credit cards, generally comprehensible English, and isolated walks along clean beaches. South Africa sure was a lot easier for us. Jess really loved the Boulders Beach Penguin Colony in Simonstown. We spent hours there watching them play in the surf. We decided to sign up for a 2-day, 38-kilometer trek around Cape Point. We rushed to the Buffelfontein Visitor Center in the morning to see if we could score spots in one of their huts. When we inquired, the woman ranger said, "For these huts you have to reserve well in advance and must start hiking by 9 a.m., which is right now." I said, "Okay, is anyone there tonight?" She said, "No, they're empty tonight." So I suppose there were some benefits to showing up midweek in the winter. We started in a drizzle but quickly outran the storm, hiking along the False Bay cliffs. There was more vert than I expected, however this provided many photo opportunities of the coast. We saw ostriches, 3 turtles, and 2 or so whales out on the bay. There was a graysbach, hartebeest, eland, and dozens of lizards, ibises, geese, hyrax, and other birds. The Finbow's fauna was even more interesting. The strange protea, ericas, pincushions, and featherhead flowers were incredible. We couldn't identify most of them, so we just started our own game. Pink fluffies, mini jade baobabs, yellow spikies, pinecone bush, etc. It was great hiking, but somewhat challenging. We dropped packs at the Protea hut and walked out to the old lighthouse and then on to Danger Point. The Portuguese were the first Westerners to sail here in 1488, trying to find a way to get Far East trade routes around the Islamic State that had spread across northern Africa and Spain.
Give you a little tour of living arrangements this evening here at the Cape of Good Hope. We're in Protea hut. Got behind door number 1. Kitchen all to ourselves. Pretty nice. View's hard to beat. Cliffs on the Indian Ocean side. Beaches on the Atlantic Ocean side. Nice front porch. And beds. And the bathroom. With the flush toilet and the shower.
The region is known for harsh weather in the roaring 40s, but remained calm for us. We were beat from the long hike, but cooked a wonderful creamy chicken broccoli soup with hearty bread and marinara macaroni, which we ate with a beer while watching the sunset over the Atlantic. After the trek, we decided to head north again. We were planning to visit the West Coast National Park to see the wildflowers, but because it was raining, we instead headed inland to the winelands, an quaint college town called Stellenbosch. Along the way, we sampled Simon Sig's offerings, which were quite tasty. We were particularly fond of their award-winning Pinotage, though I fancied the Cabernet Shiraz blend a little bit more. I'm usually not a white wine person, but Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blancs in South Africa are very good, and very affordable. Bottles run about $3 to $10 here. Sprinkled among the grand wine estates are shanty towns with hundreds of tiny houses with rusted corrugated metal roofs. There are dozens of people trying to hitchhike in the winelands. It's clear these laborers are the reason the prices are so wall-friendly. With a 29% unemployment rate here, it sure keeps the labor prices down. The following day, we walked outside of Stellenbosch to the wood mill for a chocolate festival. We indulged in lots of chocolate, but also enjoyed craft, gin, beer, and wine samples. We struck up a good conversation with a nice couple taking a weekend away from their kids, and ended up touring the Stellenbosch brewery and visiting a local pub with them. It's always fun to hang out with the locals. Toward the end of our time in South Africa, we found a nice campground in Kleinmond. There was only one other camper in the place with 100 spots. We cooked Gouda cheeseburgers and watched the birds and local mongoose hunt for evening snacks. The beach was 100 feet from our tent, so we heard the crashing waves all night long. It was cloudy in the morning until we rounded the Klogelsberg Mountains. Then the sun and Cape Town sprawl greeted us. We had a lunch at Wolfgat Nature Reserve on the sand dunes surrounded by lily flowers. It was a lovely final day at the southern tip of Africa. In the morning, we caught a flight to Johannesburg and then on to Antananarivo, Madagascar. The vacation from our vacation was over. We were now plunged into the heart of Madagascar, where there are no lane lines, potable tap water, enforced litter bans, or credit card purchases. We booked a car through Drive Mata for our next 10 days. We met our driver, Radisua, at the airport. Radu was a very friendly gentleman, and having him around was great to take a lot of the stress off the trip. It was much cheaper than renting our own car for some reason. and he masterfully passed the semis, motorbikes, ox carts, and minibuses on the twisty mountain roads, with no obvious passing areas. Radu was also very informative, and had kindly taken the lead on booking a few hotels along the way. They were a little more expensive than I normally would have booked, and I probably would have camped a little more, but it was nice to have the luxury. After sitting in traffic in the capital of Antananarivo for a couple of hours, we broke into low mountains on our way to Andasibe. There were many people working the cropland, planting rice and working the fields even though it's the dry winter season. They pump water from the rivers to grow the rice year-round, and it will be ready to harvest in 3 months. Most people in Madagascar make about $2 a day and survive with rice as the basis for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Radu says he eats 1 kilogram of rice every day, which we verified over the next 10 days of our trip. Jess and I had a wonderful day exploring the Andasibe primary forest, hunting for the adorable native lemur populations. We started with a 5-hour guided hike/bushwhack through the Analamazotra Reserve, where we eventually tracked down 5 native species of lemurs, including the common brown sifaka or dancing lemur, nocturnal eastern woolly lemur, the tiny bamboo lemur, and the lemur the park is most famous for, the black and white Indri lemur, which is the largest remaining non-extinct lemur. The Indri howls with loud whale song pitches. They fly through the forest like monkeys, but have raccoon-like faces. The guide was also very good at spotting owls, forest birds, geckos, and chameleons that we would have missed, and provided information about plants used in tribal medicines, animal diets, etc. In the afternoon, we visited Vakona Lemur Island and Crocodile Park. Lemurs don't swim, so a 20-foot canoe ride was required to get across the moat to the island that contained the trained population of 26 lemurs, who would climb over tourists for a piece of carrot or banana. I felt a little bad for them, but feeling their soft fur and tiny hands crawling all over your shoulders and head was awfully good fun. They also had a few other species, like the red ruffed lemur and black and white ruffed lemur. The crocodiles at the other park were sedate and uninteresting, but the park also included mini chameleons, nearly invisible leaf-tailed geckos, and the critically endangered radiated tortoise from southern Madagascar. We finished the day with a night hike where we found mini frogs, chameleons, 2 mouse lemurs, and another eastern woolly lemur. African business models always impress me. The plentiful potholes in Madagascar could swallow cars, so Malagasy kids fill the holes with rocks and dirt in the hopes that truckers running shipments from the eastern port to Tana will toss out a few hundred ari to them for the repairs. There are no school buses here, so children walk 1 to 1.5 hours each way to school. There are few bicycles in the country, and the roads are lined with walking commuters. I would estimate that 40% of the people are barefoot, 50% have flip-flops, and 10% have shoes. Only primary school to grade 6 is government subsidized, so 50% of children drop out in secondary, 75% are gone by high school, and only 5% make it to university. In addition to Malagasy, children learn French in school, so naturally as Vaza, or gringos, we are greeted with bonjour and bienvenue, even though there are more British and Americans that visit Andasibe annually. Madagascar is a sad story, really. While beautiful, its landscape is a visual depiction of man's rape of the planet. When humans arrived 2,000 years ago, 90% of the island was forested. Now less than 16% still is. We passed whole forests felled to make charcoal, which the majority of Malagasy use for cooking. The 106 remaining lemur species who evolved over the last 50 million years have increasingly restricted habitats. 44 lemur species are endangered, and 38 lemur species are critically endangered. Fortunately, ecotourism may save these little guys from the brink. Let's hope it does. The Malagasy are a little lax with their personal protective equipment when doing work. When casting aluminum pots, they would do it barefoot. For this and many other reasons, life expectancy is only 65 years. We were told there are two places we don't want to go in Madagascar: prison or the hospital. I think that was sound advice. All the child laborers are hard to watch. They're tending to animals, fixing roads, planting rice, and definitely not in school on a Thursday. My other major complaint about African countries regards the currency. I get that there are cash economies and not everything can be put on credit cards, but making your largest bills 20,000 ariary, or about $5, is ridiculous. To pay our driver in cash, we had to empty 2 ATMs and exchange US dollars to get 95 bills. My wallet was bursting. Radu had a collection of music videos in his car, and he was kind enough to introduce us to some Malagasy tunes. His favorite musician was Daddy Love. It was upbeat music, typically with a lot of booty shaking. On the west side of the island, we entered Baobab country. The trees are leafless except for a couple months of the year and store 32,000 gallons of water in their engorged trunks to survive droughts. Jess claims the trees look like they're upside down with the roots exposed. It's likely some of the trees we saw along the avenue of baobabs were around when humans first made landfall on the island 2,000 years ago. Sadly, some 1,000 plus year old baobab trees are suddenly dying of an unknown cause. Many suspect it's linked to hotter temperatures from global warming. Many hours of dusty, bumpy, hot driving and 2 sketchy ferry crossings transported us north to Bekopaka, which acts as the launching point for Tsingy de Bemaraha National Park. The journey was actually fairly enjoyable with a long lunch of fine French cuisine at Mad Zebu and friendly kids at the ferry crossings. The ferry crossings in this area were completely crazy. You drive 5 or 6 cars onto rickety barges that had a couple of outboard motors to get us across. We drove a portion of the stretch in a large caravan of 25 or so 4x4s, with armed police escorts stationed at the front, middle, and rear of the group. because a couple of years ago there were robberies of cameras, laptops, and money along that stretch of road. We managed to get through without incident, and everyone waved, smiled, and occasionally danced for us along the way. The Tasinge National Park hosts an ethereal, otherworldly collection of caves, slot canyons, and razor-sharp rock formations. The karst limestone has been eroded with acid rain and undercut with groundwater to produce a mythical world straight out of Indiana Jones or Tomb Raider movies. The forest of limestone needles seems to levitate in place. The caves and canyons were covered with vines and roots, spiderwebs, bats, and geckos. There were 11 species of lemurs in the park, including the Vanderdecken's sifaka, with distinct white fur and black face. This area was used by the Vazimba tribe in the 1700s as an impenetrable base against invaders. The meaning of the name is something like tiptoe through the big sharp rocks, or loosely, where one cannot walk barefoot. The really cool part of the area is that there's an easy via ferrata trail through the park, so you harness up and walk through the forest of knives, across bridges, and tiptoe on rock steps nailed to the wall, all the way through. Toward the end of our time in Madagascar, we went to the Karindi Forest Reserve. There, a male Fusa walked through the park, drank from a washing pail, and picked through the trash bin. We were warned to keep our distance because he had bitten multiple people already. These Fusas hunt lemurs by day. Later that evening, within the dry deciduous forest, we found the gray mouse, red-tailed sportive, and fork-marked lemurs. But our guide was terrible and may have misclassified some of them. That evening, as we were settling down into our mosquito-netted bed, with the lights out, we heard the bathroom door hinges suddenly creak very slowly and loudly open. It was the sound straight out of every horror film, and flicked on my headlamp to see who had joined us in the room. To my surprise, I saw a very small mouse lemur jump from the top of the door to the windowsill and back again. Just breathed a sigh of relief. The thatched roof on our bungalow left a gap between the wall, and the world's smallest primate had weaseled its way in. I snapped a few blurry photos of it climbing around before carefully ushering him out the door. Then we headed back to Morondava, where we relaxed a couple of days. On the way, we had a flat and all the guides gathered around to help out. We had the tire patched by hand, and then we were on our way again. We enjoyed our time in Morondava. Unfortunately, the cheap $8 fruits de mer plate gave me horrible food poisoning, and I puked all night long and couldn't really stomach anything for the next 24 hours. While I was curled up in bed, Jess did some exploring along the beaches and found a lot of local kids to befriend. The last stop of our trip was Mauritius, and I must say Mauritius lived up to its self-proclaimed paradise reputation. The tiny subtropical island nation continues to gain more traction with tourists, who come for fancy beachfront lodging and all-exclusive resorts. Tourism is a whopping 11% of GDP, though I'm surprised it's not a little bit higher. I cashed in a bunch of Marriott points to give Jess and I a glimpse of the glamour, but we were pretty darn broke at that point, so we still ended up washing clothes in the tub and eating cold sandwiches for dinner. In our 6-day visit to Mauritius, we visited the Chamarel Waterfall, 7-Colored Earth, and climbed Black River Peak in the Black River Gorges National Park. The island has loads of beaches, but the waves on the east coast are frightening. We mostly sheltered on the west and enjoyed calm seas. Everyone here speaks Creole and French, despite it being a former British colony and current Commonwealth nation. It actually was colonized by the Dutch, French, and then British, so they somehow ended up francophone but driving on the left. In 1968, they gained independence from the British. Unlike so many other African nations, Mauritius managed to create paved roads, good bridges, effective sanitation systems, potable water runs in the tap, and people seem happy. Amazing what effective governance will do for a country. While I was there, I took ProDive Mauritius's PADI Advanced Open Water Diver course. It required 3 days of diving, covering navigation, deep dive, peak performance, buoyancy, wreck, and fish identification skills. This area of the world doesn't have the best reefs, but they've sunk mini boats in the area for divers to explore, and new reefs are starting to form on the holes. I was lucky to explore Stella Maru, KT Mawar, and the Water Lily site, each with their own character. As the only one in the Advanced Open Water Diver course, it was great to explore as a two-man team with my instructor. We spotted electric rays, trevally, blue strip snappers, hermit crabs, emperor angelfish, and so many more.
Kayaking out to this island, and for some reason the steering's gone out.
Let's tell the world all the things we've done.
Jess and I took a tandem sea kayak out to Isle aux Benetours, where we strolled along the beach. I set up the camera for a normal photo of us, but knelt down to pop the question. She was completely surprised. I can't believe she didn't see it coming for months. It took her a second, but she emphatically said yes. On the paddle back to Mauritius mainland, the skies darkened, but a beautiful rainbow marked our route to port. I think it's a good sign of things to come.
I've been everywhere, man. I've been everywhere, man. Across the deserts bare, man. I breathe the mountain air, man. I've traveled, I've had my share, man. I've been everywhere. I've been to Louisville, Nashville, Knoxville, Omaha, Shefferville, Jacksonville, Waterville, Costa Rica, Pittsfield, Springfield, Bakersfield, Shreveport, Hackensack, Cadillac, Fond du Lac, Davenport, Idaho, Jellicoe, Argentina, Diamantina, Pasadena, Catalina, see what I mean? I've been everywhere, man. I've been everywhere, man. Across the deserts bare, man. I breathe the mountain air, man. I've traveled, I've had my share, man. I've been everywhere.